Hello, friends. Welcome to Three Books from Hearts and Minds. I am Sam Levy from the CCO, Transforming College Students to Transform the World. And of course, I'm here as always with Byron Borger of Hearts and Minds Books. Byron, how are you?
I am good, Sam. It's great to be here. Love doing this podcast. I hope some people are listening and interested in good books. We got three books to talk about from our little bookstore here in Dallastown, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, well, and it is, as you are listening, it is now the year 2025. Wild. Time keeps flying by. And it's the new year. So you probably have, whether at the forefront or in the back of your mind, these themes of any resolutions that you've set or goals that you have, or simply kind of getting back into the flow of work or school or life rhythms after the holiday disruptions, wonderful disruptions as they tend to be. And maybe you are thinking, amidst all of those thoughts, that you want to engage your creative side. Maybe that's part of you that has been neglected in the midst of everything going on in life. I know I feel that way at times. And what better time than the new year to think about creativity? And Byron, I believe you have a few books to talk about along those lines for us today.
You read my mind. Well, we talked about it ahead of time. So thanks, Sam. Yeah. When we talk about New Year's resolutions and stuff, it's interesting how many people that I hear about as a bookseller, people that are going to start reading more books or they're going to read more novels. Maybe they're nonfiction. They read theology and basic living stuff about discipling others or church life. And they're like, I need to read some novels. And so they kind of start the year with a fresh take on reading habits and creativity and imagination. So I thought I'd pick a couple of books on that topic. And man, we got a bunch. It's hard to narrow them down to three, even if you exclude the ones that are mostly about the arts proper and just look at the imagination and the creative process. We have a big stack of books for people that just want to be more creative, whether in their own life or in their business world or their leadership. Creativity and imagination is one of the things that we really underscore. I'm going to start off with one that is not well known. It's from InterVarsity England, so it's published from the UK, and it's called The Imagination Manifesto. The Imagination Manifesto, a call to plant oases of imagination. They think the local church or other nonprofit ministries could become like an oasis for people who are longing to break out of the technological, AI driven marketing kind of constraints and be free to think widely outside the box and be beautiful. And there's something human about creativity and imagination. And that as Christians, we are sent into the world to be oases of the beauty and goodness of God. And so, certainly, the oasis of imagination is a great sort of metaphor for the notion of the church or a fellowship on campus or wherever at your local coffee shop, wherever your little group meets, that it's an oasis of imagination. And well, this is sort of a manifesto for doing that. It's actually drawn from a much bigger, fatter book, which is good, but I'm not going to mention that one. This one I like because they got a U.S. jazz singer, blues singer from Philadelphia that some of us know to co-write this edition with him. Is Ted Turnau is the author. That's Turnau, Ted Turnau, but also Ruth Naomi Floyd. Ruth is a splendid Black gospel singer and jazz singer, an artist herself. She's also works for Prison Fellowship, at least used to. And we met, some of us at the Jubilee conference that the CCO runs, met her years ago when she came in with Bill Edgar, a theologian and jazz musician who did a show on the history of Black music, whether that's jazz or blues, and did the history of Black gospel music. And she sang some jazz renditions of songs years ago. So some of us know Ruth and admire her immensely. She's from Philly, and Ted works in Europe, actually. This is just a great book to remind us why we need an imagination, why we need to be creative, why God calls Christian people to foster that conversation in our culture, and why we sort of have to have a manifesto that would connect the church and the world, if you will. I like books that are sort of punchy and eager to call us out and to have us engage culture. He has 9 main points. I won't go into them, but 9 main points that are like a manifesto that Jesus calls us to love and serve our neighbor. And part of that is not imposing our Christian values, but inviting and evoking the best that the human culture can offer. We need to plant these kind of creative spaces. And I just think this is a great way to get thinking in the new year about our calling to be people that promote this sort of engagement of culture. It's not about the culture wars. This is not about taking over, but it's about creating a safe space for creatives and others to find a way to get in touch with beauty and goodness and hopefully God.
Yeah, that not to sneak in another book here, but it makes me think of Andy Crouch's great book Culture Making, and the way that he talks about the way to change culture is not just to oppose it. You can't just boycott it or protest it. You have to create more of it. You have to create culture that that actually upholds the values and aligns with the imagination of the world you believe in, put your hope in, and so that is a really important point to make.
This book cites Andy in culture making, and of course Ruth living in Philadelphia as friends. They're friends together. So if you like Andy Crouch's culture making, that's a 4th book we could list here. If you like that classic by Andy, certainly this is a great little punchy call to get serious and do something about it, and sort of a guide, not only how to have an imaginative worldview, but how to actually live it out and get involved in producing and making culture and having conversations that are actually generative and productive for our world. So I love that little book, and it's sort of an invitation to action, and I kind of like that. Let me tell you about a second one. And this is not an invitation to action, but it's a more slow, careful read about some of the most important creators of the 20th century. And let me tell you who the book's about. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. They had this gang of writers that were collaborative together, meeting in a back room called the Rabbit Room there in England. And the Inklings became a writing group that produced some of the great literature of the 20th century, from the Chronicles of Narnia to the Lord of the Rings, and so much more, poetry and others. These guys, Lewis and Tolkien, were good friends, one Catholic, one Protestant. They learned all kinds of languages so they could laugh and teach together and tell each other children's stories. And they produced a worldview, or a philosophy of aesthetics, if you will, that somehow created myths to stand against the harsh downside of modernity. So these guys were smart and philosophical, 16th century students that they were. They took the rise of modernity with a grain of salt and realized there's things deeper in life than merely facts and science. And so this book is actually called The Mythmakers, The Mythmakers by John Hendrix. And the subtitle is The Remarkable Fellowship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. It is one of the better books I have read on the Inklings, although it's mostly just on the two of them and their friendship. And I could give you a list, if you want to email me, of other great books on the Inklings and the collaborative generative process of creativity, Bandersnatch, that they did. They called it that. And so there's a lot of work on this. What makes John Hendrix's book so extraordinary is, drum roll please, ladies and gentlemen, it is a graphic novel. It's written with illustrations. He is a master of the art form. He is a great, great illustrator. And if you can see this, if you're watching on YouTube, if you're just listening to this as a podcast, go to YouTube and take a look, because you're going to want to see these lovely, thoughtful illustrations. It has some text, as you can see, and it also has then the classic graphic novel approach. And some of it then goes into Tolkien and into Lewis and Narnia. So there's these sidebars where he illustrates that stuff. And then he comes back to them hanging out at Oxford, and when they were together as friends, and their death, letters that they wrote to each other. I mean, the illustrations are just excellent. This guy is a renowned graphic designer. He did another book like this, by the way. I'm not sneaking in another book, but just so you know, he did a book called The Faithful Spy, which is a graphic adaptation of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life, with all the Bonhoeffer movie and all the interest in Bonhoeffer. It is one of the really good books on Bonhoeffer, and he superimposes letters and stuff, and the course, he was killed in the Holocaust, and you have those kind of pictures, all told in this sort of cartoon illustration style. So it's a graphic novel on the life and friendship of Lewis and Tolkien, and how they collaborated as friends to be generative in their creativity. And get this, again, he gets into this, how creativity is creating myths that resist the narrow reductionism of the 20th century philosophy of modernity, the modern French Revolution idea that the Enlightenment gave us, that all life matters are brains, like we're brains on a stick. And no, we're more than brains. And imagination is part of a good apologetics of the world. We want reason and arguments for the Christian faith, but we also want dreams and visions, myths and hopes. And so the gospel, as understood by these guys, created a foundation for them to create this antidote to the reductionism of modernity. So it's both a story of their friendship, it's a story of their creativity, it's a story about the works that they did, and also it is, between the lines, a critique of the secularized modern modernity that would sort of reduce everything to nothing but data points. So I'm really fond of this book on creativity. I'm fond of this biography of Tolkien and Lewis, and I'm fond of the artwork style of John Hendrix, who is such a talented Christian artist. I really, really like this. It's a great read. It's a great gift. Highly recommend it for the new year.
That is so cool. And I think sometimes we're tempted to think that, the creativity, the work of imagination, reading fiction, making art, these things are like, if we have some extra time, or when life isn't as stressful or chaotic. But I was actually reminded the other day of the setting that those guys, Tolkien and Lewis, were creating these myths and these worlds and these characters. Were in the midst of the world wars and all kinds of turmoil and great suffering that was going on, not just around the world, but in their very lives in England where they were. I was reminded of this by remembering that in the Narnia series, the whole reason in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that the kids find the wardrobe is because they've been shipped away from London to stay safe from the bombings that are happening. Yeah. And so this work of engaging in creativity and myth making and imagination isn't just for the margins of life when things are going well or manageable, or peacetime, so to speak, but are for the real trenches of our life, no matter what's going on.
You are so right, Sam, and I'm glad you brought that up. Lewis wrote an essay called Studying During Wartime, that even in the midst of war, we are called to use our minds and to think carefully about philosophy or whatever. And so our callings and our vocations are sort of in the context of the fallen world in which we live. So there's tragedy and horror in our personal lives and in the culture at large. And we push back with beauty and goodness and love and grace, and a generative kind of worldview that is the deepest understanding of the Christian faith can give rise to these very beautiful things that push back against the darkness. So yeah, last time in our podcast, we talked about Epiphany, the light breaking into the world. Well, this is part of that, this creative gift of the generosity of God, and then artists using their gifted abilities. And of course, what Lewis and Tolkien would suggest, and certainly that first book really suggests, is that we are all called to exercise the culture making, myth making, beauty and goodness of God in all of our lives, whether we're professional painters or not. Whether you're a writer, you can be a reader. Whether you make paintings or just look at paintings. But, we're all called to express creativity in various ways, whether it's the jokes we tell or the clothing we wear or the interior design or the kind of ways we cook our food. We're all different, and nobody needs to be highbrow or have certain expectations about that. But we are creative beings because we're made in the image of a God who is known as the creator. He speaks and stuff happens. He makes a world and he says, that's beautiful. That's good. And so our very creativity is rooted in the goodness of God and being made in God's image. So yeah, we're all called to this kind of work. And I just thought the Lewis and Tolkien book, done so creatively as a graphic novel, is a really fun book. You could give it to a teen, you give it to a younger adult, but I think old people should read it as well. It's a really nice way into this conversation about Lewis and Tolkien and their playing and writing during wartime.
It's great.
Can I tell you about another one?
Yes. What's our third book for today?
All right. 3 books from Hearts and Minds on creativity. We looked at 2. Here's the third one. And man, it's hard to narrow it down, but I wanted to pick this one because it's written by a woman that we know. It's written by a woman that is extraordinarily gifted, who is primarily a writer, but she's written a book called The Discipline of Inspiration. If you can see this book, it's by Carey, Wallace. And the subtitle is The Mysterious Encounter with God at the Heart of Creativity. And so what Carey is doing here is giving us sort of a foundational way to think about this creative process that we all have wired within us, that we can be inspired, we can be creative. As we think about our own creativity, if it is God that's behind it, if we are made in God's image and his Holy Spirit gifts us with the ability to make stuff, to be inspired, to dream outside the box, if that's God's doing, then we should be able to encounter that God as we're being creative, right? It's just sort of almost like this is a practice of spiritual formation, a way to encounter the divine by expressing our own creativity. So it is the discipline, as she calls it, of being inspired and then having a God encounter as we learn where the inspiration comes from in the first place and how to then harness it for your own life and work. It's not primarily about being an artist, although she is, or being a writer, although she is. It is more about how to be creative in life and work, but that creativity has to come from God. And so our inspiration leads to not only a more flourishing kind of life in the world, but also some kind of spirituality as we encounter the very God who is the one that fuels our imagination. Isn't that an interesting notion? It sort of weaves around a flourishing life in the world, the creative process, and the spiritual practice of the discipline of hearing God's voice as you're trying to be an art maker or a faithful, creative, flourishing person in the world.
That's great. I love it.
Want to know something interesting about this book? It's very, very cool. I'll tell you just a little bit about who Carey Wallace is for what it's worth. I met her at Redeemer Presbyterian years ago when we were selling books up there in New York, Tim Keller's church, of course. So she's a conservative, evangelical Protestant, at the time at least, there in the Reformed PCA church that she went to. But she's also an artist of the first order. And at the time, she was working on her first novel. It got published on a mainstream publishing house, and it got great acclaim. It's called The Blind Contessa's Daughter, or The Blind Contessa's New Machine is what it's called. And it's a novel based on a true story of a woman who is blind and the invention of the typewriter. And
wow.
When you find out the backstory of how the typewriter got invented, it's a great story, but it's a kind of a mystery, romance, human interest story set in Italy in centuries earlier, called The Blind Contessa's New Machine. She read another one. She wrote a children's book called Stories of the Saints that is a large, oversized picture book of saints of the past, and it is the most spectacularly illustrated, creative, and impressionistic. It's a wild book. I adore that book called Stories of the Saints. And then recently she did one that's a very beautiful book called Psalms of Wonder. And there's some of the Psalms of praise of the Old Testament illustrated with a lush, deep, dark blue hue to it. So the lovely Psalms book, the Stories of the Saints, the mainstream novel that she did, these are all part of her own creative output. And here she finally got down to business of saying how it all happens for her, how she writes, how she discerns what to do, how she finds inspiration, and how this has to do very much with the foundation in God. Well, let me just tell you one other little story before we wrap up here. Carey, I said, lived in New York, and she's in the literary world. She's written this Blind Contessa's book. When she wrote that book, she got a letter from a reader who adored the book, who sort of became a friend. And that reader will mean something to the few listeners out there who know anything about the history of women in rock music or punk rock music. It's an author and writer and punk rock singer named Patti Smith. Patti Smith, of all people, who, again, if you know punk music, she's hugely significant in the art world of New York and in the rock and roll scene. Patti Smith read her novel and loved it and wrote her a letter, and they became friends. I think this is probably, it's published by Erdman's. I think this is probably the only Christian theological book It has a blurb on the front by a famous punk rock star. It says, "This book articulates the beautiful complexities of what drives us to create and what we encounter when we do." Well, who we encounter is Jesus Christ. She says that. This is the Erdmans. This is a Christian writer. Patti Smith raved about this book, loved it. And so I just thought this was cool. When I first read this blurb, I thought, oh, that's funny. Some theologian has the same name as Patti Smith. Carey told me, actually, it is the Patti Smith who endorsed this book. So there's a little creative moment from the marketing department at Erdmans, putting a punk rock star, an edgy bohemian artist, on the cover of this wonderful book called The Discipline of Inspiration. Way to go. I'm excited
about that.
Yeah.
Well, there you have it. If you are looking to lean into your creative side, to engage your imagination, to view the world through that imaginative lens so that you are better equipped to make art, if that's something that you do, or just simply to navigate your way through the world as a follower of Jesus, as someone who's thoughtful and who is a part of this call to live out this kingdom on earth as it is in heaven through a kingdom of God type imagination. These are some great books to point you in the right direction. So we are very grateful for those of you who've listened to this episode, and we would love for you to order these books. Remember that you get 20% off anything from this episode that you order. You can just go to the first link in the episode description, and that'll take you to the order form. We would love for you to like and share this episode. Tell your friends about us. Feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear from listeners. Contact one or both of us and read these books and share what you think in the comments or in an email. We'd love to take this conversation further and hear your thoughts. So for Byron, Hearts and Minds Books, and the CCO, this has been another episode of the 3 Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. Bye, friends.